Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final session. I want to thank everyone for coming throughout the semester. I've learned a lot, and I hope you have as well. So today is our final lecture, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Professor Peng is an assistant professor at Princeton, who is jointly appointed in the School of Public International Affairs and the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. Her current research focuses on two major streams, one on health effects of deep decarbonization, which she'll talk about a little bit today, but I think the main focus is on her other side, which is about the political economy of integrated assessment modeling and making, her title here, Making Climate Policy Models More Decision Relevant. So with that, I will turn it over to her, and yeah, thanks.
Testing. Okay, awesome. I heard that this is your last day of class, so congratulations on getting this far. I hope I'm going to keep you entertained for the next hour and a half or so. And I will be talking about making climate policy models more decision relevant. So since I will be talking a lot about computational models in the next 40 minutes or so, I want to start with something more personal. Since I grew up in China, how about we start with this question? What was China like 40 years ago? Most of you probably don't remember, me neither. I wasn't even born, but this is something I do remember. I grew up in a city called Changsha in southern China, and about 20 years ago, we got our first airport terminal for international travel so that the people in my hometown could travel internationally. And about 10 years ago, we got our first train station for high-speed trains. And about 5 years ago, we got our first metro line running in the city. Now there are 5 of them. And Changsha is only a second-tier city in China. If you're looking at a larger city, that was Shanghai in the 1980s and Shanghai today. So you can see that when you have the right people, right incentive, working in the right direction, miracles could happen. But the past is in the past. The more relevant question, oh, by the way, that economic growth that did not come without a penalty. So in order to fuel that economic miracle, the energy consumption in China has been increasing rapidly, and so did the CO2 emissions. So if you have ever heard about China as the major pollutant, that the energy was the reason behind it. But as I just said, the past in the past, the more relevant question is perhaps this one. What will China be like 40 years from now? For this question, I'm sure nobody knows, but we do know the direction because the country has pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Looking at how the CO2 emissions has been going up over the past 4 decades, the country will need to completely reverse that trajectory in the next 40 years. And China is not the only country in this race to net zero. Here, I'm also showing you United States and the EU, and their target is to reach net zero by 2050, even 10 years earlier than China. So then the question becomes, how can China and the world transform our energy system and reach net zero a few decades from now? And to answer that question, this is where models come in. So using energy models, people have been trying to see, hey, with existing policy, are we on track to bend the curve? And unfortunately, the reason so far has been no. Then the question is, what are the additional efforts that will be needed in order to really change the system and reach those deeper decarbonization targets? So in short, model has been very useful to evaluate where can we be with current policy and what will be the additional need to transform the system in order to have more ambitious targets. So on the one hand, I have been super proud about how my community has helped over the past few decades, both on the international scale, especially through the IPCC process, and also domestically in a lot of national decision making. However, I do see a fundamental challenge of the models we have, which is our models focus so much on technologies and much less so on humans. And here's one such example. If you have ever read any of the IPCC report, you probably have seen figures like this, where they show that, hey, in order to reach very deeply decarbonized goal, like 1.5-degree targets, you will need to quickly phase down your fossil fuel and quickly scale up renewables. And once you started thinking about human, you're going to ask a very different set of questions. On the one hand, given how dependent we are on fossil fuel today, and to many people it's even their jobs and livelihood, can we really phase down and phase out fossil fuel that quickly? And also, given the public opinion and also other infrastructure barriers, et cetera, can we really scale up wind and solar technology as required, was suggested by the model? And that's just one side of the story. The other side is that this transformation is going to change our life. It's going to change the way we drive, the way we live, and to a lot of people, their jobs as well. So what does this transition really mean to human in terms of the environmental implication, the health implication, the equity implication? So if I can ask you to remember just one thing from my talk, it's going to be the title here. Once we start to thinking about how to thinking about feasible climate mitigation, our models need to get real about people. So, and that comes to the main thing that I'm going to talk about today, and also the question that my group have been thinking a lot over the past 5-10 years, and also the question that sometimes keep me up at night. How can we make models more relevant to real-world climate policy decisions? So there are many different ways you can model energy system. And a lot of the focus I'll be talking about today is how can we incorporate human system modeling with one of the energy system modeling tools called the integrated assessment models, so that we can really focus more on informing climate policy decisions. In case you haven't heard about the IAM, like how many of you have heard about IAMs? Oh, good, then I have a slide for most of you. So in just one slide, how do IAMs work? Usually this kind of models start with exogenous input about GDP, population growth, policy targets, other technology assumptions, etc. And then all this input are going to go into a core model where a system of systems is being modeled. For example, there are interactions between your economy, energy, climate, and land system. And you can see there are a lot of the times I use the two-way arrow because many of the linkages are indeed complex. Let me give you some examples. In order to meet the future economic growth, then we need to thinking about what does mean for our energy demand in the residential sector, transportation sector, etc. And then the question becomes, what energy technologies we're going to use in order to meet that demand? And depending on our technology choices, that will have implications on the CO2 emissions. So that will influence our climate system, and also the land requirement. So you can see that there are a lot of interactions here, and sometimes the interactions are even two-way. So for example, the way we use energy is going to influence our climate future. However, if we end up in a warmer world in the future, that's going to increase our AC demand during the summertime and reduce our heating demand during the wintertime. So you can see that really for example, the interaction between energy and climate should be two-way rather than one-way. Coming out of this model, we usually have things like economic costs, energy pathways, emissions, and also land use implications. So this is really just a very high-level diagram of how IAM works. But you could imagine that for any box I show in this figure, you can either go for a very simple representation or a very sophisticated representation. For example, if I focus on the energy system, I can just one very high-level equation to have a stylized representation to say that if our energy system change, what does it mean for the emissions? And along those lines, there are some IAMs built with that flavor. For example, the DICE model is, if you have heard about Bill Nordhaus' work, who won the Nobel Prize in economics a few years ago, his work is more in that space. But because I care more about feasibility, so most of our work is looking at the detailed process IAM, where we really track that process of the physical and material flows. So for example, how our primary energy is going to go through those processing and conversion processes, and finally changing our end use demands. So this like detailed process IM will be the category of model that I'll talk more throughout my talk later on. So now that I talked a little bit about what is IM, let's talk about how the human system modeling part. So when I'm thinking about the human system, there are at least two aspects. One is human action, the other is human impact. So on the human action side, the issue of IM is that these kind of models tend to make overly simplified assumptions. So what I show you here are some examples of human actions, aspects of human actions such as actor aggregation, societal interaction, action endogeneity, etc. And you can see that from left to right, these are idealized representations to more realistic representations. What I highlight in yellow here are roughly, thinking about the IMs today, where do they locate in terms of those assumptions related to human action? So you can see that most times IMs are on the simple or idealized side of the spectrum. That's the reason why many times it is not entirely clear how to make the connection with the actual human action in the real world. That's the human action side. Then on the human impact side, to me, the biggest challenge is that IMs are too coarse and usually don't have the right variables. And let me give you just 3 quick examples. So from the IMs, we usually have things like global mean temperature. But to be honest, nobody really living the global mean temperature. What we really care about are the local climate damages and our local weather system. And from the IM, we generally have regional level air pollutant emissions. But what we really care about as the impact side are the local pollution exposure and also the health effects. The final example I have here is that IM usually give us the regional total mitigation cost, but ultimately the climate problem is all about winners, to a large extent, it's about winners and losers. So it is a distribution of the cost across regions and population groups that's going to matter much more. So if you're thinking, now that I've talked about what is IM, and also what's the challenges for the IM to do human system modeling, then the question becomes why the modeling community hasn't done enough. And to put it very simply, I think part of the reason is that we are all on the same page regarding the importance of making models more realistic, but what remains challenging is what modeling areas to prioritize. And I would argue that we should really be thinking about in 2 dimensions. One is how useful is our model advancement to decision makers, because in my view, like our model advancement takes a lot of time and it's only worth the efforts if they can really help the real world decisions. And the second dimension is ease of modeling. So in other words, how tractable is our problem to have a quantitative representation in the models. Here, the ease of modeling, I'm not only talking about do we have the data, even though data is always a big concern. Here, I'm also talking about is the human action related or human impact related theories are ripe for inclusion in a quantitative way in our models. For example, there are a lot of theories around social norm or social tipping point. All those things are so stylized and qualitative, they're not ready, in my view, for inclusion in quantitative models. But in comparison, some of the other examples may be more tractable, as a result, more compatible as the starting point to be incorporated into the models. So the thought process that we have been having over the past few years is really try to populate this 2x2 matrix, or this like 2-dimension space in general. And let's try to see what are the problems that are important and also tractable. And we should really go all in those questions. And gradually, we should also move ourselves to the area where it's hard to do well. But because it's so crucial for the decision makers, we should really challenge ourselves as modelers to do more. So in a nutshell, through this process of thinking about how useful to decision makers and how feasible to model it, my group and our collaborators have been thinking hard about where we can prioritize our efforts. So that leads to the next 30 minutes or so, where I want to give you 3 quick examples for the research areas that we have been really focusing on. So the first area regarding the policy consideration is more about realistic. And the example I'm going to give today is about how we have been improving the representation for policies so that we can do more on the policy system modeling side. The second aspect is equitable. And there, our methodological advance is thinking about doing model coupling between an integrated assessment model and impact assessment so that we can do better regarding capturing the winners and losers and also the distributional effect. The last example, I'll be talking about really the robust consideration. And there, the advancement in the human system part is going to be how can we identify trade-offs on the future uncertainties. So before I go into my examples, any questions so far? Okay. So now let's get into my first example, which is about realistic. And the key policy question we're going after here is thinking about this transition from one nationally uniform approach to state-driven policy approach to climate action. Here's just one example. This map shows the number of mitigation activities by states. And you can see, and this is from the National Climate Assessment that I contributed to, and it came out last fall. You can see from this map, all those like darker blue colors are the states that are climate leaders. Places like New York, California, Washington, etc. Those are the places where we definitely have many more climate actions going on at the state level. But in comparison, so when you're thinking about like, states trying to take the lead in climate action, it is much more realistic and feasible because when states decide what they want to do and how much they can do, they can try to align better with the local priorities. It can be jobs, it can be air quality, etc. And they can also design actions that are more compatible with their administrative capacity. So because of that, the state-driven approach has proven to be much more politically feasible. But is there a concern related with that? Yes. The key reason, one of the major concerns, is that if you're really looking at the map, there are states that are not doing as much. Looking at some of the Midwest states. And for a lot of those states, because they haven't been doing a lot, so the marginal cost to bring down emissions is actually lower in those places. So thinking about California and New York, we're already doing a lot here. As a result, the marginal cost to bring down our emissions is going to be much more. We need to go for those slightly harder to obey technologies and sectors. But in comparison, it could have been cheaper to mitigate in those like lighter color states where there are still more low-hanging fruits. So here there's a central trade-off in a sense that the state-driven approach is more politically realistic, but maybe we're losing some economic efficiency because of that. And that's the question we try to quantify using models. So the central model we're using here is a state-level integrated assessment model called GCAM USA, the Global Change Analysis Model, with state-level representation for the United States. So this model tried to capture the linkages between 5 components that include energy, water, land, socioeconomic, and climate. And it ran at 5-year time resolution. And the GCAM USA is the version of the model where it does have the global interconnections, but at the same time have state-level representation for the United States. So that's the basic IM part. Then the question becomes, what is the key human system challenge here? And in my view, the key challenge here is that how can we project state variation in policy efforts in the future? We kind of know where we are today, but how can we get a sense of which states may do more or do less in the future? So the approach we took in this paper is that we start with the public support data from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. So on that map, the darker is the green, the higher is support rate that people respond to say that, hey, my local officials need to do more to mitigate climate change. And On the one hand, we do know that roughly there's a positive correlation between your public support rate and policy efforts, right? So the more people are supporting climate change from the public opinion perspective, it's more likely that the state officials are going to do more. But on the other hand, what we do not know is the exact functional form. But the good thing is that using models, you can test out different functional forms and try to figure out under what conditions it's going to matter. So this is one example. So we try to link the public support rate with the projected policy stringency level in the future. Again, we kind of know it's positive correlated, but how can we really thinking about different potential political conditions? So we first start with a heterogeneous case, which is the purple line over there. And what we assume is that in addition to that rough positive correlation, we also assume that there's a steeper increase around 50% support rate according to the median voter theorem, because the median voter decide who get elected. So potentially there is a more drastic change around that time. In addition, we also consider another hybrid case. It is a combined federal and state level case. So we say that all the states need to do at least this much, and that threshold is determined by as the 40th percentile as we rank across the states, and that's to reflect 60% voting threshold of passing legislation in the Senate. So all the states at least need to do this much, but if you are New York or California, if you want to do more, of course you can do more. So by having this kind of representation into the model, this is the projected variation in the policy stringency in the future. So those states with redder colors, those are the states with lower public support rate, as a result, lower carbon price. As a proxy, we have in the model for policy stringency level. And all those states with bluish color are the states with higher support rate, as a result, higher carbon prices. And those like green, yellowish color states are the states in the middle with median support rate and also the median carbon price level. Across the country, we're talking about a variation of 3 regarding the state level policy stringency level. So with this representation of policy heterogeneity, what did we find? So our first finding is that the state distribution of the mitigation costs really depends on your policy approach. The left figure shows you if you go for a nationally uniform approach, which states are going to have a higher mitigation cost as a percentage of the projected GDP in 2030. So you can see that, not surprisingly, those states, especially in the Midwest, they have lower marginal cost to mitigate. As a result, they're going to mitigate more if you go for a nationally uniform approach. And that's the reason why they stand out with those darker purple colors. In comparison, if you go for a state-driven heterogeneous approach, you're going to see that like dark purple color spread out a little bit more. So now you're going to see less concentrated cost as we go for the state-driven approach. So that's the first finding. But ultimately, we also care about the total cost as a country. And using models, what we have found is that there are a few key conditions under which the national policy costs will go up a lot. And those conditions are whether or not we have interstate trade for climate leaders, and also whether or not we ensure that there are some efforts from the climate laggards as well. So let me explain through the figures here. What I'm showing you here is the mitigation cost to achieve 80% decarbonization by 2050 nationwide. And I show you with different colors, the mitigation costs in high supporting states, medium supporting state, and low supporting states. So as you can see, the first bar here is the uniform approach, nationally uniform carbon price. As you move from left to right, more state heterogeneity, what you're going to see is that the low supporting states are going to do less, and the high supporting states are going to do more. But in that, at the national scale, we're only talking about less than 10% higher cost across the country. And the key mechanism there is that we assume that there are interstate trade for electricity and also bioliquids. And because of that, even if you are California or New York, those climate leaders, you can still tap into lower cost production options in the other states. As a result, not really increase the cost that much. However, We have also tested alternative formulations of policy heterogeneity, such as what if the relationship is not nonlinear but linear? What if we use a different public opinion question? What if we what if we don't even use public opinion? We use like current policy stringency to project the future policy stringency. But across the board, you can see that most of the results are kind of similar, except for those two bars I highlighted in the middle. And those two bars represent the situation where those 3 or 5 lowest supporting states do nothing. And if they do nothing, but the country as a whole still need to reach deep decarbonization, then we're going to push the rest of the country to do much more and pursue relatively more expensive technologies, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or other technologies. So in other words, those are the 2 major conditions that we need to think about in order to keep the nationwide mitigation costs not too high, but embrace the policy heterogeneity in order to make it more feasible. So that concludes my first example. Any question about this one? I know we'll have a lot of time in the end for the question. I just want to check if there are clarifying questions for now. Okay, so if not, we can now move on to my next question, which now we touch on the question about equitable. So the policy example I want to give here is how can we start to thinking about the country varying effects on air quality and health as a result of a global mitigation. So I want to first start by what is already the conventional approach or conventional wisdom. So using the IAMs, people have studied questions like this. If we have climate mitigation, how is this going to influence energy and land use, and as a result, influence the emissions of CO2 and air pollutants? And people have also started to consider, hey, there will be different like population and socioeconomic projections. And if we have that, that's going to influence our energy and land use as well. So all the gray part I highlight here have been the conventional wisdom or conventional approach from the IAMs. But now, we want to really make it more relevant to really what we feel from the transition, that is human health. So if we really want to make that connection from what IAMS has been doing to what we really care about from the impact side, here are the additional linkages we need to model. First of all, we need to start to think about how that emissions are going to influence pollution exposure. And the pollution exposure is just one part of the equation. The other part is how vulnerable is our population. For example, the elderly populations are more vulnerable to pollution exposure, just like COVID. Even with the same level of exposure, they have higher risk and they're more likely to die. So what we do in this project is start with what IAMs can do, but really start to build those modeling capabilities so that we can start to evaluate human exposure, human vulnerability, and also what does it mean for human health. And this work is led by my grad student, Yang, and her paper published last year in Nature Sustainability. Okay, how exactly did we do it? We start with using IAM, those like traditional methods I have been talking over the past 20 minutes already. We used global IAM to design 5 future scenarios, and those 5 scenarios vary in 2 dimensions. The first dimension is on the socioeconomic trends and air pollution policy side, and those they range from like sustainability 1 to fossil fuel ones. And the other dimension of those scenarios are what is the target level of warming by the end of the century? So ranging from RCP 1.9 to 8.5, we're talking about really limited warming by the end of the century to much more extreme warming by the end of the century. So in case you are familiar with the IAM world, the 2 sets of scenarios are called the shared socioeconomic pathway for the socioeconomic part and the representative concentration pathway for the warming side. And then we really want to link from there to our health outcome. And here, the example metric I'm going to show today is the premature deaths from exposure to ambient air pollution. So this is the middle part we filled. So from the IEM, we first downscale the emissions to fine scale, and then we put them into an Earth system model. Here we use the GFDL ESM4 model so that we can get two things. One is the climate variables like temperature and precipitation, other climate variables by the end of the year, by the end of the century. And the other thing is the similarity level of MB and PM2.5 concentration. So PM2.5 are the fine particulate matter in the air. They're so small, so it can penetrate into lung and have like health damages, both long-term and near-term. So that's the first part. But exposure, as I said, is just part of the equation. So on top of that, we also did population downscaling so that we will know that we will project the future population size and also the future aging pattern. And finally, we also use a development forecast model to project what will be the future baseline mortality rate look like. So I've already explained why aging matters, because the elderly population are more vulnerable to pollution exposure. The reason baseline mortality rate matters is because even if we don't expose to air pollution, there's still a baseline level of risk of dying. So this baseline mortality rate captures, for example, like healthcare access and other social demographic features. So usually what people have found that as countries get wealthier, the baseline mortality rate is going to go down because of the healthcare system and other socioeconomic developments, regardless of the pollution level. By combining all these factors I highlighted here, we can finally estimate the outcome we care about, which is premature death. So through this model coupling and downscaling method, what did we find in the end? I want to highlight two findings. The first one is that we find that with climate mitigation, pollution exposure is likely to go down, but the health burden may still go up. And this is one example. What I'm showing you here is one of the 5 scenarios that we explored. This is RCP1 coupled with, SSP1 coupled with RCP 2.6. So you can broadly think of this as a low carbon development pathway that gets us to less than 2-degree warming by the end of the century. So my first map up there shows you the PM2.5 concentration by the end of the century compared to today. So you can see a lot of purple. And also purple is the dominating color in that map. That's essentially to say that by the end of the century, for most places, the pollution is projected to go down. But now if you're looking at the map in the bottom, that's the PM2.5 attributable death. So now you start to see not really a lot of purple, but primarily orange. And those are the places where the PM2.5 related death are projected to go up, even if the pollution exposure level is going down. I'm thinking maybe you're already starting to guess what are the underlying drivers? Is it because we have more people living on this planet at the end of the day, or something else? So to answer that question, that highlights our second finding, which is that we actually find population aging and the declining baseline mortality rate could play a more important role than population growth or the changes in exposure. And here I just want to show you 3 countries or regions as an example. So what I show you here is for that same scenario, what is the contribution of different factors to that aggregate changes in PM2.5 related deaths? Let's just take India as an example. So you can see a very positive orange over there, and that's the effect of aging. What it's showing you here is that holding everything constant, because of the population aging, the PM2.5 related deaths can be 10 times higher by the end of the century comparing with today. But luckily, we have other factors that will counteract a lot of those aging effects. One of those things is that gray bar over there, and that's PM2.5 concentration. Thanks to energy transition, we're going to reduce pollution level, and that's going to bring down the health burden. But you could also see the importance of that blue bar over there. And that's the effects of declining baseline mortality rate. So in other words, suppose India is going to get wealthier over time, and India is going to be in this one particular scenario based on the model assumption, the baseline mortality rate is projected to go down, and that will bring additional benefits to reduce the health burden from pollution exposure. So you can definitely also see that across different parts of the world, the relative importance of different factors are going to be different. And that's really the major takeaway from the second example here, which is to say that the social demographic factors are going to be varying across the countries, and they will play a very important role in thinking about the future health burden from pollution exposure. So this concludes my second example. Any clarifying question for this one? Okay, now we can get to my last one, which is now thinking about the question about the robustness. So if you're thinking about what my previous example, the second example was all about, it's pretty much about this. It's about what are the health benefits, especially emission reduction benefits we can get by displacing fossil fuels with lower carbon ones. But once we started to move away from just thinking about phasing down fossil fuel and start to really embrace the net zero transition, we also need to start to recognize that there may be emerging health risk from our large-scale mitigation efforts. One of the examples people talk the most about is how mitigating climate change through bioenergy is going to disrupt our land system and create competition with food production, and that may intensify or worsen the dietary-related health risk. But the key thing that I think is crucial to think about is that nobody really knows what the future is going to be like. So how should we start to consider and get a grapple of that wide range of possible futures, and how is that going to influence whether or not we get health benefits or potential health harms? That's the central relevant policy question we want to tackle here. Can we start to think about the health impacts from climate mitigation, but consider future uncertainties? And this work is led by my other PhD student, and yeah, that paper was published in Nature Sustainability 2 last year. Okay, how did we do that? The key thing we did in this paper is that we used an integrated assessment model. I hope by now you're familiar with them. It's called GCAM. And we used that model to construct a large-scale scenario ensemble. So we consider one simple decision lever. Do we have a global carbon price or not? But the key thing is that we combine that with 7 categories of major uncertainties people have found to be important for decarbonization. Things like socioeconomic, energy demand, agricultural and land use, etc. By combining all those, so for each factor, we consider a few levels. For example, for socioeconomic, we consider SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as I showed in the previous example. For things like fossil fuel extraction costs, we did consider low, medium, and high costs based on some of the expert elicitation outcomes. So by combining all those different levels for each of the 7 factors, we end up with a scenario ensemble of more than 28,000 scenarios. And then for each of scenario, we do something very similar as my example 2. So we first study how the system interaction may play and get a sense of what does it mean for the air pollutant emissions and also GHG emissions. And by combining that information with things like GDP and population, age structure based on mortality rate, we will be able to get this kind of outcome for each of scenario, including the climate outcome, the health outcome, and also the regional distribution of the impact. So really, if you think comparing this one and the previous example, the key thing we want to study is that traditionally people have been, including our example 2, have been really focusing on just this green line, which is to say, if we have carbon pricing, if we mitigate climate change, this is going to reduce fossil fuel, as a result, reduce air pollutant emissions, and hey, that's how we get health benefits. But is there possible that we also have potential pathways for co-harms where, for example, we have carbon mitigation, as a result, increase the bioenergy use, and on the one hand, this can directly increase the air pollutant emissions, and that may bring us health co-harms, or it may disrupt our land system and having complicated implications on the air pollutant emission from the land use sector. So this project is really about, under that wide range of possible futures, under what conditions are we going to see health co-benefits, and under what conditions we may start to observe unintended consequences such as health co-harms. So with this ensemble, what did we find? So the first insight we have here is that we did find consistent health co-benefits in most countries, but we did also find unintended co-harms in some other places. So what I'm showing in this figure is that all those places in blue, such as India, China, most of the African countries, in those places across all those 28,000 scenarios, we see a co-benefits. In other words, with the carbon price, we're going to see reduction in pollution level and a reduction in air pollution related health burden. But you could also see there are a lot of places where I highlight with that gray line over there. Those are the regions where among those 28,000, there's a subset of the scenario where we actually find the emissions can actually go up, and so does the health burden. And in fact, in some places such as Canada and Chile, we even find the ensemble median, which is to say half of the scenarios actually give us a slight increase in their air pollution emissions and health burden. And I have to say, that was really confusing. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand why did those co-harms occur. So in short, it's pretty complex. So in the model world, well, we find that the pathways for health co-harms involves interactions both between sectors and also between regions. So let me try to quickly go through some of the example figures. What we find is that once we have a global carbon price, that's going to change the energy use. So across the country, across the world, most countries are going to reduce their share of coal, but at the same time, increase the share of low carbon resources such as bioenergy and renewables. And that will influence the emissions. So the SO2 emissions, for example, are going to go down because the coal combustion is the leading source of emission for SO2. But at the same time, we can also see some of the organic carbon emissions going up. And the main reason is what I highlight in the blue box over there, that the bioenergy use is going to intensify the land competition. And in the model world, it intensified deforestation, as a result, increasing organic carbon emission from deforestation. And because of that combined effect of multiple precursor emissions, this is what we observe for the changes in pollution exposure. And finally, this is what we observe for the PM2.5 attributable death rate. And that's what I meant earlier, that for places like Canada, like even the ensemble median is a net positive. Then you may ask the question, how realistic is that blue box I highlight over there? Where are there ways that we can intentionally reduce the co-harm? So we did a lot of sensitivity rounds around that question. And one thing we find to be one of the most important model assumptions we have found that lead to that co-harm is actually the deforestation approach. So this figure here is exactly the same one as previously. Let me just go back to this one. So I just replot this again as an example. So that's where you see places like Russia, United States, and Canada. There are scenarios that have a co-harm to occur. But suppose now we change the assumption, instead of like open burning as the main way of deforestation, how about we just change to clear cutting as a sensitivity round? Which you're going to see that once we change that one single assumption, we're going to eliminate all of the co-harms that are observed in those countries that highlighted there. So in other words, deforestation approach is the key assumption for co-harm to occur. And as a result, this highlights the importance of coordinating your climate policy and land use policy to really embrace the health co-benefits and avoid the unintended consequences. So this ends my last example on the robust side. I do have a couple slides as my closing thought. So most of the work I presented so far are the work that are already out there. The key ongoing work we have been working on right now is start to link and not only advance each kind of area, but also start to link these three areas I was talking about. So for example, on the realistic side, we have now started to do a lot more work about policy instrument choice and policy sequencing. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A. And the key model advancement we have been doing is to work with political scientists thinking about what kind of policy processes and institutional factors that are tractable in our model, and can we start to put them and see how this might change the decarbonization outcome. On the equitable side, we have now started to think a lot more about the distribution of cost and impact. And there, we're now like, the example I gave was more like the global scale, but we have now do a lot more work also at like the sub-national scale and regional scale so that we can thinking about the health disparity in more detail. Lastly, about the robust, previous example was really about stylized policy representations, right? Like the carbon tax that would never be implemented. So we have started to think a lot more about what are the desirable policy designs to address multiple objectives. And I also want to highlight that we have also started to think more about how can we couple those efforts on the realistic and equitable side and integrate them as a large-scale scenario ensemble so that we start to thinking about the uncertainties in social, institutional, technological, and other dimensions together and thinking about the robust policy design. Two last slides. So these are my closing thoughts, more like open questions. So thinking about the human system modeling, I think there's a lot of value to think more about how can we link human action and impact and also challenge ourselves as modelers. Can we start to endogenize policy choices? Here's just like one stylized example. So a lot of so looking at this country in particular, the more feasible policy choices today relies a lot on carrots, those financial incentives like subsidies, for example, to clean technologies. But we cannot rely on carrots forever. At some point, we need to switch to sticks, those regulatory approaches, so that we can really have the level of deep decarbonization that will be needed. So the question becomes, for the policy choices today, they are going to have differential impacts, both on different kind of industries and also on population groups, and how this may influence the interest group formation and also technology competition. As a result, determining what kind of policy choices will be more or less possible in the future. And along this line, as a modeler, a key thing we also need to keep track of is uncertainties, because we know that the social system is highly uncertain, and for things like technology, innovation, and learning, it's very uncertain as well. So this is my first closing thought, like how can we start to thinking about, how can we start to do better to endogenize policy choices? The second closing thought is that IM is just one of many modeling tools that are out there. I mentioned early on that we start with IM as a starting point, but really if you're looking at the quantitative modeling world for energy transition, we have a ton of options. For example, we have IM, as I talked about. We also have more regional scale modeling aiming at engineering optimization model. A lot of electricity system modeling is in that category. We also have a huge group of modeling called agent-based modeling, and they're better at capturing individual and more like urban scale issues, but they can really have different decision rules and capture different kind of actions for different actors. So if you really start to question challenge this question about the institutional and human representation, these different kind of models are good at representing different kind of institutions. As a result, they are also best suited in capturing different kind of actors. So in my view, the other really important frontier for this community in general is thinking about how can we start to learn from each model and creatively couple different models so that we can really leverage the insights that are relevant for different skills and for different actors and decision rules. With that, yes. Oops. Okay, this is an important slide. If I can get it back. Okay, great. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank my group members, collaborators, and our founders, because it really takes a village, especially across different disciplines, in order to tackle this question, how we can make climate policy models more decision relevant. So with that acknowledgement, happy to end here and answer any questions you may have.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question related to, I guess like more so real world implication. Are there any existing IAMs that have successfully integrated policy choices within their framework? And if so, can you provide an example?
Yeah, can you be a little bit more specific about what do you mean by policy choice? Because there are like easy things that people have done, but they're like more difficult things people have not. So what is the kind of policy choice you have in mind?
It's like maybe like the most maybe complex or applicable example you could give.
Yeah, okay, great. So great question. So what I would say is that all the IAMs, so first of all, there are different IAMs. There are roughly like 5 to 7 IAMs that IPCC has been using. So that's basically the type of the IAM world people have been referring to. All those models have implemented carbon tax because, first of all, it's easy to model computationally. Second, is also the economically optimal choice. If your goal is to reach deep decarbonization, right? The Econ 101 tells us that carbon tax is the best way to, if you treat the climate problem as the externality problem. So I think all the models are capable of modeling carbon tax. And I think gradually more and more models are able to capture current policy. So for example, if a country has a target to say, I want to have 100% EV sale by 2030, or if I say that I want to have 80% renewable by 2050, those quantitative targets can be implemented in IM fairly straightforwardly. So those are the policy choices that I think the IMs are very capable of doing. But is that sufficient? I think it's far from sufficient. There are a few reasons why I think it's not. First of all, if you're thinking about those mandates, renewable portfolio standard or the sales target, those are just like small subset of the policy choices that the government is pursuing or the decision makers are using these days. There are a lot more financial incentives and there's a lot more regulations. And for those kind of a different policy instrument choices, we really need a different way of thinking about of modeling their costs and impacts. The other thing I think is two things. The other two things I think are not sufficient. The second thing is we should really be thinking not about single policy, but a portfolio of policy mix, right? If you're thinking about what EPA, what DOE, and also the New York State has been doing, it's never one policy. It's always a wide portfolio of policy covering different technologies and different sectors. So our analysis about like single policy is not going to be sufficient unless we start to embrace to thinking about policy combination and policy mixes. That's the second thing that I think is insufficient. The last thing I think is insufficient is about this dynamic choice that I was talking about in the end. I don't think any IM team or any modeling teams in general have really a good solution for that. So how should we thinking about today's policy choice as a way to influence tomorrow's interest group and tomorrow's like public opinion, as a result, influence what policies will be feasible tomorrow. So in my view, those are the carbon tax and the current policy is what we can do, but there are like more things. We really are not doing a very good job right now, and there's varying degree of modeling complexity and tractability along those lines. Did I answer your question? Perfect.
Hi. So at your third example, you were kind of talking a little bit about deforestation as a form of like carbon solution.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how have people kind of reacted to your studies showing the downsides of renewable technologies, even though you are giving proposed like fixes, like what's been the overall sentiment around that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because people don't like what we find, simply put. I think they're like different. I've got the sentiments like why they don't like it, so I can just get a sense of like, give you an idea of why they don't like it. So I think from the more technical side, there are a lot of people don't like what we find because, and I think they're right, that at the regional scale with the national scale, the resolution is not sufficient for you to study anything related to energy transition or deforestation or land use. So remember the example I gave just now, we used the GCAM model. It only has 32 regions around the world. That's the resolution. So a lot of people are upset about what we find because they just think that, at that level of resolution, you cannot really like answering the land use question very well. And I get that. But I also think that there are like other people are upset about what we find for a slightly different reason, which is, hey, we already have a lot of negative stories to tell about climate mitigation, and now you are adding something more. especially through the bioenergy side, about the negative framing about climate mitigation. And in my view, I have a very different angle to that story, because the way, remember I showed in the end that the deforestation approach is crucial. I think the way to interpret our model study, in my view, is to really emphasize what are the type of policy coordination that will be needed in order to make sure that those unintended consequences will not occur. Because guess what? They are avoidable. And using our policy analysis, we demonstrated concrete ways how you can avoid that. So for that second kind of like reason why people dislike it, I kind of feel that it's more about the messaging issue, and also it's more about like the communicating the right message so that we use our study in a more meaningful way. Is that good? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah.
In a previous question, I think you said that a lot of the IAMs use carbon taxes to model emissions reductions.
Yes.
But from, I guess, my knowledge of it, I think it's a very politically controversial policy idea in the US. So how politically feasible do you think like a sufficiently strict carbon tax would be compared to like a
not feasible today, if I can keep it short. So that's a great point. I think there's a joke I always tell my students that I always wanted to live in the model world, because in that world, if I want to have a carbon tax, it's just a line of code. But this has proven to be so difficult around the world. I think the only exception we have is EU, where they have the EU ETS, which is a carbon market. Everywhere, tax is hard, right? So I think this is not only a challenge for the United States, it is also a problem for China, Australia, any countries you can think of. So in my view, I think it is a consensus around the world, because we have all observed what has happened. So it is a consensus that carbon pricing, especially carbon tax, has very low political feasibility in almost any institutions around the world. But I think the more important question is that, yes, I get it is difficult today, but is it possible for us to use technology levers or political levers so that we can create a strategy for the future, so that we actually create the condition for carbon pricing to be more feasible? Because I do think carbon pricing is needed, required, in order to reach deep decarbonization, as all the countries are envisioning right now. So this is why I think endogenous policy choices, or the policy sequencing story, is crucial. Because what is not feasible today doesn't mean that it's not feasible tomorrow. It all depends on what we do today, and can we create an opportunity and a space for that.
Thank you.
Hi. So I know you talked about like older populations being vulnerable and like health risks in the models. I was wondering if those models take into account like younger populations and their potential vulnerability, and if so, to what extent?
Yeah, we do. So I think I have to think twice about this, because we have too many studies. But generally speaking, both the younger population and the older populations are more vulnerable to air pollution exposure. The key difference is that we actually have more empirical evidence for elderly population than the younger population. So in order to, that creates challenge for people like us, right? If I want to do a global level analysis, and then there's more evidence for the elderly population, so my results is going to be more robust and solid for that population. So I think in this particular study, we probably didn't really do the, for example, like two-year-old or younger kind of children early mortality analysis, because I think the empirical evidence is less robust comparing with the adult population. But you're absolutely right. I think that's crucial, especially for African countries, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I think you kind of already answered this, but I was just wondering if there were any other models that you were looking forward, to creating in the future.
Yeah, great question. Wow. Suppose I have like $1 billion and unlimited students and postdoc, young talents to work with me. What will be my dream situation? First of all, I'm a big believer that global models are not super decision relevant, because, well, let me put it this way. I think global models are useful if our question is about, the big picture climate stabilization thing, and also just point to the direction for climate negotiation. Yes, I get that. But we don't really have a very powerful decision maker internationally, right? We do have those treaties, we do have this climate agreement, but with very few exceptions, such as WTO, most of the international agreements are not very useful in really like changing countries' behaviors, for example. So that's why I'm a big believer that we should really pursue a decentralized model for modeling so that and also a lot of, not surprisingly, we have many more models, especially subnational models for countries like United States, EU, Australia, New Zealand, etc., as compared to like India, African countries, Latin America, etc. So in my dream world, I really think we should pursue that decentralized model of modeling so that we get the subnational models for countries that are really crucial for the decarbonization challenge. That's one thing. The other thing I would really hope we can achieve as a community is to really embrace a plurality of our modeling approaches. And that's the point I was hoping to get in my second to the last slide, that IM is just one of many models we have. The reason I started with IM, I chose to start with IM, is because that community has used like 30 years to build a relationship with IPCC and as a result with national decision makers. So because they're so connected and used so widely, I worry more about misuse of IMs. So that's the reason why I start to work with IMs and start to have the human system modeling. But I do think that over time, we should really also, the problem that IM have, many of the other models also have. So I do think it's crucial for us to really start to thinking about, for any kind of models, can we collectively thinking about the institutional question, behavioral question, and finding the right modeling method and strategy for that question. So those will be the two things I hope would occur if I have unlimited money, unlimited time, so that we can do better as a community. I love that question.
First of all, thank you so much for your energy and your lecture today, Professor Peng. And my question is probably more general,
Sure.
Not only about your modeling, but also like all the kind of modeling probably nowadays on the world. It's like, since like I know like sometimes the input of the data can be really like dependent like on the country that collect the data and also how they're reporting that. Even sometimes there can be concerns like how honest or how like reliable the data is. So I wonder like, how in a global modeling like this kind of issue can be tackled, or like what kind of bias you guys will expect this kind of like problem to generate?
That's a fantastic question. And that's also the reason why I was saying earlier that I think global models have limited usefulness to some extent. Because when you have a global model, you have to deal with the question you were asking just now, which is hard to completely avoid, right? Because you do need, for example, you need the demand data, you need the energy infrastructure data, you need the social demographic data for the same level of detail and accuracy for United States comparing with like Chad or Nigeria, those different countries. And it's just very hard to really do that right now. We have a, whenever you see a global model, you actually, the underlying data set is definitely uneven in terms of the credibility and usability. But to answer your question more broadly, I do think that things are changing in the right direction. Well, there are small things changing in the wrong direction, but I want to highlight the positivity. I think the things that are changing in the right direction is that previously it was all about companies or entities reporting data, and the central government need to collect them. But now there are more decentralized approach that people have become really creative in getting the data. For example, I think a lot of folks now using satellite data to get the infrastructure development for African countries, for example. And in my field, air quality modeling, there has been a lot of like data fusion between satellite data and machine learning techniques so that they can really fill in the data. It's not ideal, but they can start to fill in the data for those part of the world that's still like scarce in the data. So that's more like the technical side. But like if you're really talking about institutional side, this is also the reason why I was mentioning that decentralization is needed for the modeling community, because ultimately you need the people who are on the ground. Like you need Malaysian building the Malaysian energy system model. Like you need people in India building their own model. You should, in my view, is less ideal if you have a parachute kind of research to say that, hey, we're a US team, this is our model, can you use it? That's probably not going to go well, in my view.
Thank you. I was just wondering, like, if we have decentralized like policies, how, especially like in the US, I know there's a lot of like depending on where you are. Like I'm from Indiana, where there's like a ban on like plastic bags, like banning plastic bags. You can't do it with like policies and like a local level. Like how do you think you can get like both like policymakers and also people on like a normal level to just like be more willing to like accept changes when it comes to policies?
Yeah, I have to say, this is something like I need help from you folks, the younger generation, because to me, one thing that keeps me optimistic about the climate problem is that you folks are going to be the future. So hopefully you folks are going to change the social norm around like what is possible in terms of like energy transition and climate mitigation. That being said, I can answer your question more like a scholar. So it is very hard, but it's not, I think from the modeling perspective, the approach people usually start with is thinking about, given the local governance structure, like for example, what is the composition of your state senate, or what is the like public opinion in your area, what kind of policies are more likely to pass in your jurisdiction? And the other relevant point here is that I think people are very strategic in thinking about the policy windows, like window opportunity where the things can change. So for example, whenever you have a turnover of your, like the state senate, for example, like you have new members coming in, or on the air quality side, every couple years, the state need to do a state implementation plan regarding how they're going to implement the next stage of ambient air quality standard. So there are like policy windows that are going to open up every now and then. And those are the opportunities we need to seize and see if we can make the potential changes to happen. So it's not I know it's not an ideal answer to your question, but I guess to me, it's like in the short term, keep an eye out for the policy windows at the local and state scale. And in the long term, counting on your folks to change the social norm.
Thank you. My question is related to some of the questions on how to use those models in like other countries and stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm personally from Brazil, and I'm just thinking how in a country that just is much more centralized, the power is just in one government rather than like states.
Yeah.
And just wondering what we can learn from that, like thinking that like climate is changing so fast that maybe we'll not have like in South America the power to build all those models so soon. So like what we can actually learn in terms of action to change like policies there, that I know it is a different place, but can we just skip and try to act sooner?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Are you asking more about from the modeling side, how we can learn from each other, or from the policy side? Because I have very different answers to those.
Yeah, I mean, just seeing the models, can we learn something to like because maybe we just don't have enough time to do all of that. And I guess that like the models are useful to know what to do in terms of policy. So
Great
how
question.
to like learn from that?
Yeah, so I think in general, using models, we already know what are the key foundations for decarbonization, right? They're just like a couple things you need to do. You need to decarbonize your power grid. You need to increase end-use electrification as much as possible. You need to pursue energy efficiency. Like you need to pursue some of the land protection measures so that you don't get, CO2 emissions coming out of your carbon sinks, etc. So in general, I think if you're really looking at the playbook, how to reach net zero, I think through the modeling community, the modeling efforts over the past few decades, we already know that playbook, the general playbook, the countries need to pursue. But is that super helpful? In my view, no, right? Because the question really becomes, yes, broadly speaking, decarbonize your power grid. What does it really mean for Brazil versus India versus China versus the United States? It's very different. Different in a few dimensions. The first dimension is resource availability, right? In Brazil, I think hydropower and bioenergy, it's of course going to be a critical point of discussion. Whereas in China and India, our discussion right now is still all about how can we manage a very large coal fleet. Whereas in the United States, thanks to the shale gas boom, we have already know that coal has to be gone because the natural gas, even though it's a fossil fuel, is very much cheaper than that. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make here is that if you have a general model, you can already have the general insights. But I don't think general models are super helpful to really say, like, especially in the near term for the next decade or so, what are the critical things each country need to invest in? And because of that, I am really a cheerleader in my field to say that let's just do more at regional level and also country level, so that we don't give people a general guidebook, but we really give people a fine-scaled like decision support tool in terms of what are the next thing for them to do. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Let's say thank you to our final speaker. Thank you, Professor Peng.